Well, to talk about the carbon tax / rebate, we're now joined by Adam van Koeverden. He is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Andrew Scheer is the Conservative House Leader. Hello to the two of you.
Hi there.
Hey, Michael.
Listen, Adam, I'll start with you. And with that, I want to begin here with a bit of what we heard from Premier Fury of Newfoundland and Labrador last week, because he had this to say about this hike in the carbon levy. He said, quote, "It is causing understandable worry as people consider how they will manage the mounting financial strain." You know this, Canadians are struggling financially right now. Is your government turning a blind eye to that struggle by not addressing this increase and stopping it before it happens?
Well, addressing the affordability crisis that Canadians are experiencing right now requires us to talk to experts and listen to economists and listen to Canadians as well. And that's what we've been doing. And from the beginning of our plan to fight climate change with the price on pollution, we've tried to reassure Canadians that the rebates are sending more cash back to 80% of families in Canada. And those tend to be the 80% of lower income families. The top 20% that pay a little bit more tend to be wealthier, and they tend to drive larger cars and heat bigger homes. But I understand why people are anxious right now. It's a really tough time financially. But in order to tackle that crisis and make sure that Canadians have enough money to pay the bills, we've got to look at the root cause, and that's inflation. And it's also important to listen to economists when they tell us, like point blank, that the price on pollution is not one of the main drivers of inflation. Inflation exists around the world in countries that price carbon and in those that don't, and it's actually lower in Canada than in a lot of countries that don't have a price on pollution or a carbon tax. So I want to reassure Canadians that they'll be receiving more back through the rebates in 2024 than they did in 2023, and it's a pillar of our program to lower our emissions in Canada and fight climate change, as so many other countries. We're one of about 50 countries in the world that are using carbon pricing to lower emissions, and it's working in Canada. Our emissions are down since 2005. We ran on a commitment to lower our emissions in Canada by 40 to 45% of 2005 levels, and we're on target. We're on the right path, whereas in 2015, Canada was on the wrong path. Our emissions were going up in Canada, and now the only sector in Canada that still has their emissions going up is the oil and gas sector. So look, we have more work to do. We have more work to do on fighting the affordability crisis and climate change in Canada, but it's important that governments have a plan to do both, and we do.
Andrew, how do you respond to that? Because as to hear it from Adam, again, the carbon levy is working and Canadians do get a rebate. So how do you respond to that?
There's just so much wrong in everything he said. I was actually astonished that he was able to cram so many falsehoods into one statement. First of all, the carbon tax is a major driver in inflation. The Bank of Canada governor testified at committee that the carbon tax was responsible for about 33%, about a third of all the extra inflation that is plaguing Canadians. It's significantly adding to the cost of literally everything. The Parliamentary Budget Watchdog was at committee today, and he testified that when you factor in all the secondary effects of the carbon tax, that the vast majority of Canadians are worse off. You see, what the Liberals did was they designed the rebate only to address the direct costs. So when you fuel up your car or when you pay your heating bill, you'll see the carbon tax on that. But what you're not compensated for is when the producer, the shipper, the retailer, when they all have to raise their prices to cover their share of the carbon tax, the rebate doesn't cover any of that. And what the Budget Watchdog told MPs today is that average middle income earners are net losers under this Liberal government, that the rebate doesn't cover anywhere near the full cost of the carbon tax. So what the Liberals are asking Canadians to do is thank them for taking about $2,600 out of their pocket and only kicking back $2,000. I mean, would you invest in a mutual fund where you put in $2,600 and you get back $2,000? The average Albertan family is going to be worse off to the tune of about $900. The average Saskatchewan family will be about $600 worse off. Same thing in Ontario. So the vast majority of Canadians, especially those average income earners, are going to be worse off because the rebate is just a shell game that doesn't cover all the costs.
Adam, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think Andrew and I have been on television together 3 times in the last week or so, and I think it's clear that we're probably not going to convince each other today that carbon pricing works or that carbon pricing doesn't. But one thing that I think we can both agree on is that you should follow through on your commitments when you knock on doors and ask Canadians for your vote. And in 2019 and in 2021, I knocked on doors and I told Canadians that I had a plan, and we had a plan to fight climate change and to lower our emissions. Now, back in 2019, I remember knocking on doors because Andrew Scheer, who's running for Prime Minister at that time, said that Canada should be allowed to increase our emissions. And he said that since a couple of times. So since, in 2021, with Aaron O'Toole, they had a price on pollution in their campaign platform. They've abandoned that since, but the last time that Canadians voted, if they voted Conservative, they voted for a plan to price carbon with a carbon tax. They had some kind of a green catalog where Canadians could choose how they could spend their credits, if you want to call it that. It was called the more you burn, the more you earn. Now, I'm not willing to trade on the future of this planet for short-term political gain. Perhaps Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives are willing to abandon any commitments that they either had in 2021 or didn't show in 2019 to fight climate change and lower our emissions. Now, Mr. Scheer has said in the past that he agrees with the Paris Agreement to lower our emissions, but then at the same time he said Canada should be allowed to increase our emissions so that we can offset other countries lowering those emissions. So look, Bill Nordhaus is an economist and a climatologist and an environmentalist who's got something that neither of us do, and that's a Nobel Prize in economics. And he recently said that Canada's getting it right on pricing pollution. And what the Conservatives aren't taking into consideration when they talk about all the externalities associated with pricing carbon, they're also not talking about the externalities associated with climate change. Climate change is costing Canadians over $2 billion a year, whether that's through unmitigated natural disasters, which are getting way worse, wildfires and floods. Climate change isn't free, and solving it's not going to be free either. So I want to hear from a Conservative, are we going back to 2019 where it's okay for Canada to increase our emissions? Or are you going to stick to your commitment of 2021 and have a plan to reduce our carbon emissions with some form of carbon pricing? Because Canadians are desperate to know. The Conservatives have still not told Canadians what their plan to fight climate change is, if anything.
Well, Andrew, to that, what would Conservatives do? Because right now you're campaigning against this planned increase, but your party writ large is campaigning against the carbon tax altogether. So how do you incentivize Canadians to find greener alternatives? Is that a priority for your party?
Well, of course, and what we have to do is we have to stop talking about the carbon tax as if it is an environment plan. And if Adam wants to talk about what he said when he was door knocking, I wonder if he could tell viewers what he said to voters that when he promised them in 2019 that the carbon tax would not go up under Justin Trudeau. He promised, it was a Liberal campaign promise, that they would not raise the carbon tax in 2019. And once Justin Trudeau was re-elected and he didn't need the votes of Canadians, but he still needed their cash, he raised the carbon tax. So that was a direct broken promise after committing a solemn commitment not to hike the carbon tax. Here we are on the eve of another 23% hike to the carbon tax. Under this Liberal government, Canada has fallen further in climate change action. We're now ranked 62 out of 64 countries. The Environment Commissioner has said the Trudeau government is stacking failures on top of failures. Adam's own Environment Department tabled a response in the House of Commons that said that the government can't even attribute any reductions in greenhouse gases to the carbon tax. So it is a complete failure as it relates to addressing environmental challenges. And what we're going to get if Justin Trudeau is allowed to continue hiking this carbon tax, we're going to get the worst of both worlds. We're going to still get the negative effects of climate change because countries like China are building coal-fired power plants as investments move overseas to countries with lower environmental standards. The world is actually going to see more CO2 because Canada will offshore a lot of the production that we can do here much cleaner and much greener. So we're going to get worse results on the environment and higher prices. And what Adam said at the beginning of his segment is so telling. This is the epitome of Liberal government. They're not listening to the millions of Canadians lining up at food banks. They're listening to the elites. They're listening to all the people who publish papers and fancy discussion groups. But they're not listening to the moms and dads who are going through grocery aisles, staring at the price on a package of beef and putting it back because they can't afford it. They're ignoring the real life examples that we have, the misery that the carbon tax is causing. So that's why Conservatives are going to keep putting the pressure on to spike the hike and axe the tax.
But what would you do in its place, though, in terms of addressing the environment?
Well, we can do a lot to reduce global emissions. When European allies came, when European allies came to Canada, begging at Canada to sell our clean LNG so that Germany and France and Italy could get off of Russian oil exports, Justin Trudeau said no. It baffles the mind that at a time when Ukraine is suffering from an illegal invasion, one way to weaken Putin's war machine is to displace Russian oil and gas with cleaner Canadian. Justin Trudeau said no. We want to say yes to clean projects. There was a proposal for a tidal energy program, project that would have harnessed the powers of the wave to create zero emissions energy. Trudeau government said no to that. Under Justin Trudeau, Canada doesn't even mine lithium. You know, there's all this talk and all this attention on electric vehicles and Canada's ability to produce batteries for it. And under Justin Trudeau, lithium mines can't even get a green light or a permit. So under Pierre Poilievre government, we're going to say yes to big projects that reduce emissions, that export more of what Canada can do at a much lower emissions rate than any other country in the world. And that way, we'll actually have a positive impact on climate change and bring down prices for struggling Canadians.
Okay, quickly running out of time. So my last question is to you, Adam. You know, given what we've just heard here, if the carbon tax, as you say, is so good for Canadians, then why is the Conservative message getting traction right now, not only amongst Canadians when you look at polling numbers, but amongst premiers in this country as well?
It's because of inflation, Michael, and inflation is a real problem. And I just want to pick apart two things that Mr. Scheer just said. He said, first of all, that the carbon tax was responsible for way more of inflation than the Governor of Bank of Canada said. The Governor of Bank of Canada said it was responsible for less than 0.15%.
That's not true.
And that's very, very low.
0.6% of the 3 point.
So
the
if you'll allow me, I'll let you
Just
finish, Mr.
be
Scheer.
accurate.
The other thing that Mr. Scheer just said is when you asked him about lowering Canadian emissions, he went right to global emissions because his plan is to increase Canada's emissions because he believes, as he did and campaigned in 2019, that Canada should be allowed to raise our emissions. Even though in Canada, per capita, we have the highest emissions in the world. That's just not okay. Look, I'm not going to apologize for being an environmentalist. And we do need to listen to experts as well as listening to Canadians at the grocery store. And we need to have a plan to tackle the affordability crisis. But axing the tax and spiking the hike, as these guys keep saying, will not achieve that goal. Because food economists, people who actually study this, say that grocery prices are high because of climate change, not because of carbon pricing. So we need to have a plan to attack both affordability and lower our emissions. As the Conservatives have continually said, they want our emissions to go up, which would make climate change worse, and food will get more expensive.
Okay, well, listen, I'm sorry we're out of time, but we'll leave it there for now. Adam Van Koeverden, Andrew Scheer, thank you very much for the time this evening.
You bet.